right. We'll just start.
Sure.
Welcome back to another podcast of the Queer Column. Today we have with us Professor Madhavi Menon, who is a professor of English at Ashoka University. Along with that, she's also a director for the Center of Studies in Gender Sexuality and also PhD program in English. In this discussion, we will mainly aim to understand her research in queer theory, desires, and gender politics and sexuality, and we hope to take that forward with an introduction from her. Professor, would you please go ahead and give us a brief introduction about your own self?
A brief introduction about myself. I really don't know what to say, Nidhi. So I think you should ask me questions about what it is that you want to know.
Why do you look at gender and sexuality through the understanding of desires is something that really encapsulates our in the kind of interesting work that you have done, because being law students, I think it has been really difficult for us to merge both social sciences and law. But in your multidisciplinary research that you have undertaken, it becomes really easy to see how you employ that perspective. So, what really encourages you to do that? How do you gather that understanding?
I mean, I am. It's really surprising to me when I hear what you have just said. Not because I don't think you're right, but precisely because you are right that it surprises me. Because I don't understand how anyone can live in the world and not understand that thinking about gender and sexuality affects us on a daily basis. And it's like saying, oh, I don't think about oxygen, and that's true, most of us don't, but we are breathing every day in any case, or every minute of every day. And so gender and sexuality become that kind of subject that we don't think about too much, but that nonetheless shape every activity and action that we perform on a daily basis. And so I'm always interested, and I've always been interested in I think of myself as a theorist, and an interest in theory means you're thinking about the underlying assumptions that go into propping up any idea or any sort of philosophy or any way of being or any way of thinking or living in the world. And because I'm interested in theory, I've always been interested in thinking about how gender and sexuality work and why they work in the way that they do. So I'm less interested, therefore, in specific sexualities or specific gendered orientations. I'm just much more interested in what gender and sexuality as categories themselves lend themselves to performing, right? Why do we want to have a gender? Why do we want to know our sexuality? What are those about? That's what I'm interested in because I think it affects us on a daily basis.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, Professor. So our next question is kind of a follow-up, but an extension of the previous question. So most of the people we've interacted with previously, or most of the work that we have come across ourselves in law school and for the queer column, most of the focus that authors put on is categories of, say, privacy, dignity, equality for their analysis of judgments like Naz, Navtesh, Nalsa. But in your work, especially your book, Queering Indifference, the book where you write on doing away with difference to realize difference, where you write all of that. Why do you choose desire as a category to analyze the judgments and the text of these judgments? Why not use, say, constitutional doctrine, just constitutional doctrine? You do use constitutional doctrine, but you move sort of more than that. Why do you specifically focus on desire as a category?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because depending on the perspective from which you approach that question, your answer is going to be different. So, for instance, if you're approaching desire from a Lacanian perspective, from a psychoanalytical perspective, psychoanalysis actually thinks of desire as the means for binding you to the social structure in which you find yourself. So, which is to say, desire becomes the way in which you mediate your relation to the world. Um, for me, my understanding of desire, and this is the way I've employed it in all my writing, my understanding of desire is psychoanalytic in the sense of I think about desire always as that which, even if it enables categories, always exceeds them. Desire as that which refuses to be contained within the very categories that might seem to describe it perfectly to us. And so I'm always interested in what falls out, in what is missing, in what is assumed, in what is excessive, in what is lacking, rather than in thinking about desire as any kind of coherent category. So when I'm thinking about desire, I'm thinking not about coherence, not about solidity, not about fixity, not about identity. I'm thinking much more about that which refuses to cohere, that which refuses to make sense all the time to everybody everywhere. And to my mind, to go back to what Nidhi was asking about why I'm interested in this, it seems to me that that is the most apt description of every single one of us, which is that we are not consistent or uniform or single minded or unified. And especially in our desires. And so for me, it's much more interesting to think about the ways in which we do not cohere rather than paying attention to coherence itself. And so for me, desire performs that work of the thing or as being the thing that cannot, in fact, be contained within categories, which is why I think of it as an extremely powerful force. Because it's a force that actually cannot be contained within marriage or within caste or within religion or within gender. That there is something about desire that always pushes against categorization rather than affirming it.
Right. Professor, just following up from that, in your book, The Law of Desire Rulings on Sex and Sexuality in India, I think you have tried to mention many different kinds of desires which can pop up in different subjects and different sections of the society. And again, in another book of yours, in the one that Sarthak was also talking about, Indifference to Difference, you have also talked about queer universalism and how there is some kind of importance in kind of creating an indifference to the kind of differences we have as queer individuals. So we see through the judgments as well, through Nalsa, Naj, and Navtesh, that there can be a lot of queer desires which are very differentiated in general as well. How do you kind of categorize them through the judgments that pop up? Because I think the judgments which generally talk about queer desires, they tend to simplify them and categorize them into one single box. So for example, if you talk about the desires of transgender persons, they might be extremely different from the desires of somebody who identifies as a bisexual. So how do you deal with this?
I mean, the reason I am fascinated by the law is because, in addition or only next to religion, it becomes the language of absolutism, right? So the law as well is considered to have no point of origin. You cannot point to a particular person or a particular moment in time and say that's where the law has come from. The law is supposed to be always already here, right? The law is meant to be this universal language that you can't argue with or that you can't talk back to. It's the law, which is exactly how one thinks about God and religion, right? That's it is God, you cannot talk back to them. And so I've always been fascinated by law's absolutism, but also by law's complete failure to live up to that kind of absolute structure that it envisages for itself. So, which is why, of course, and this is why it makes sense for an English professor to be fascinated by the law, because the fundamental mode of doing law, and actually it's the fundamental mode of doing religion too, but I'll set that aside for now. The fundamental mode of doing law is interpretation. And the minute you are in the realm of interpretation, you have moved away from the realm of absolutism. Because, of course, interpretation is precisely the thing that can and does change from person to person, situation to situation, context to context, and text to text. So the law, then, for me, is caught in this double bind that it is, on the one hand, aiming to, aspiring to being absolute and uniform and universal, and on the other hand, depending on interpretation, which makes sure it is anything but absolute and universal and uniform. And desire becomes one of those subjects in which the law has to come face to face with this kind of incoherence, because it is precisely the thing where it cannot imagine a one size fitting all. Yet it has to come up with a one size that fits all, because it is, after all, the law, right? It is not a law or an episode of law. It is the law. It is the absolute definite article. And so then when matters of desire come up before the law, um, and this is what I've explored in my book, the law really scrambles. And to go back to Sarthak's question earlier, what it tends to do then is to fall back on certain tried and tested truisms that the law has used always to uphold itself. The most important being, in terms of desire, the idea of privacy. So privacy then becomes the prism through which the court will rule. If it's giving a good judgment, the court will rule in favor of diversity of sexualities or diversity of gender orientations and things like that. Now, for me, what I find problematic, and you'll know that already if you've read the book, is that the very idea of privacy is actually, to me, deeply phobic in relation to sexuality, because it takes as a fundamental bedrock the assumption that sex is something that should take place behind closed doors, that it has no place in the public sphere. And this in a country where the number of people who actually have access to space behind closed doors is a very minute percentage of the population. So then, of course, the question becomes, who are we making this law for? Are we making the law only for the rich people like us who can afford a room with a door? And if the answer to that is yes, then that is shameful. And if the answer to that is no, then the law is utterly inadequate. So, just from even from a practical perspective, to talk about desire within the ambit of privacy makes no sense in a country like India. It is merely parroting this notion that you get, say, from the US, where privacy shrouds sexuality. And so there is a way in which to think about sexuality in terms of privacy is already to relegate it to what in the West would be called the closet, right? It's already to sort of say, we don't want to see it, we don't want to hear about it, we don't want to talk about it. Do what you want so long as it does not, I don't have to deal with it, right? And to my mind, that attitude is an extremely phobic one. So then to celebrate judgments like Naz or Navtej, as we all do, is to forget the fact that there are deeply problematic assumptions on which this judgment is based. So, for me, my interest in the law is to try and remind ourselves of what we should not forget while celebrating these judgments that are certainly progressive in their intent, but actually deeply phobic in the way in which they are formulated.
Yeah, just a follow-up on what you just said about privacy. So there's this paper by Zaid al-Bassett on Navtej, Nals, and Nalsa, where they talk about how the entire world becomes a closet, and it's not right to say that the right to your expression of your sexuality and gender is somehow related to your right to privacy, because a lot of people might not just have access to private spaces. And this has sort of been the criticism of these line of cases in India. Um, our question here is that if you look at the current law on obscenity in India, it's sort of rooted in a very heterosexual understanding where sections like outraging the modesty of a woman are understood from very patriarchal notions. But we're sort of moving away from law here. But if you look at recent web series or recent entertainment that is being put out, there are a lot of queer depictions in India and in the West as well that are coming up. And now our definition of how we understand obscenity is obviously going to change. So do you think that depiction of desire in media has an impact on law? And how do you think that law is responding to this in current times?
Yeah, there's several things in that question. Just to go back to what you said the question was not about, which is obscenity, I'm interested in that because, of course, it becomes the complete opposite of judgments on desire and sexuality, because obscenity is judged entirely on the basis of its presence in the public domain. So, in fact, there is no question of privacy when it comes to obscenity. It is all about being in the public. And so, and this is true also, for instance, in our rules or laws about prostitution, because as you know, India does not outlaw prostitution, but it outlaws everything around it. And one of the things it outlaws is its public presence, right? So if you are a high class prostitute who's able to afford a hotel room or afford a house, or are rich enough to do to sort of offer sexual services in the in the premises of your house, then the law is fine with it. But the minute you're out in public, the minute you're soliciting on the street, that's when it becomes obscenity, right? And similarly, Obscenity becomes artwork that can be seen in public, or books that are sold in public, and so on and so forth. So there's a real phobia about sexuality being in the public realm. And I think one of the things we need to fight for is precisely anti privacy, and actually fight for the right to be in public. And a friend of mine once said, and I think this is so wonderful, that actually religion and sexuality should swap places, because religion is so public and sexuality is meant to be so private. And really, religion should be put in the closet, and sexuality should be sort of encouraged to be public, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of the situation we are in now. Whereas religion just sort of is like on steroids in public, and sexuality has been sort of pushed more and more away. And I think there is actually a direct correlation between those two developments. But setting that aside for now, to go to the latter part of your question, I don't know what web series or films or serials you're necessarily referring to. But does media affect the law, or does it allow the law to change? I'm not sure how much that does happen or how much that is true, because the law moves extremely slowly. One, so I'm not sure there'll be an immediate response to that. But two, again, as I said, I don't know exactly what you're referring to. But if you are thinking about films or serials that present quote unquote non heterosexual characters or desires or relationships, and you think that that is a move forward, to me, that is a much more complicated phenomenon. Because I actually think it's easy to sort of say, oh, this character is heterosexual, and that character is homosexual, and this character is bisexual, or whatever, however we want to categorize it. For me, what is much more interesting is to think about desires that are transgressive and desires that are not. Because, as you know, a lot of theorists have said about using phrases like homonormativity, you don't necessarily have to be transgressive just because you're not heterosexual. And so for me, what is more interesting, what is more scary, is actually films and serials showing us non-heterosexual people, but only in perfectly acceptable roles or in acceptable situations and positions. And for me, acceptability should not be our touchstone in terms of desire or sexuality. And so for me, it would be much more interesting if we were, for instance, to think about the transgressiveness of heterosexuality. So, for instance, intercaste marriages or interreligious marriages, right? Which really is so politically fraught, as the term love jihad itself suggests, that there is a way in which heterosexuality is actually far more policed today in India politically than these so-called non-normative desires, because actually non-normative desires, as the fight for gay marriage in the US and now in India also determines, can be extremely normative. So I'm not particularly interested in our patting ourselves on our backs because we have multiple representations of different people. I'd be much more interested if we were to take seriously, if our media were to take seriously, the idea of incoherence rather than identity.
Just one sort of digression from the idea, but this is a question that I wanted to ask on the basis of your book. So, how do you think the Western notions kind of have impacted the way we think of desires and queer desires in general? Because even in queer politics, in many situations, a lot of Western notions are kind of imposed on how one should express their desire and sexuality. And I think you discover this a little bit in your book, but I feel like you're the best person to ask this question.
Um, I don't know about that, but I'll try and address it in any case or answer that in any case. Um, First of all, I'm actually uncomfortable with talking about the West and the East because I don't think those distinctions actually stand with any kind of security, because it's a very porous border and we've been crossing that border for centuries. It's not anything new. So forget globalization and everything like that. It's West and East are just far more porous categories than we would like to think of. And because of my interest in desire, I'm actually not interested in any kind of sort of categorical divisions or distinctions or binaries like West and East. However, there certainly is a way in which we can think about a certain kind of uh, American language of identity that has crept into diverse parts of the world, India included. And that language of identity is very much premised on knowability, categorization, and transparency. So that language of identity suggests that we all know deep down inside who we are, what our desires are, and that we should therefore be able to situate ourselves within certain categories that name who we are. And that is the way to be in the world. Everything I'm interested in opposes that kind of language. Because everything I'm interested in is about how we do not cohere, how we cannot, in fact, claim to be just any one thing. Because I don't think we need to look too far afield or in the world around us to realize that every right wing political move around the world is premised on binary, knowable categorization. So in India, you are either a Hindu or you are a Muslim. You are either male or you are either female, and so on and so forth. So binary categorization is the language of the right. What makes it really sad for me is when I see people from the left mimicking that language in order to, for them, ascertain or enable their own freedom. Whereas for me, that language only insists that we are more shackled than we ever were. So the language then doesn't necessarily become of West or East. It becomes a certain language that aspires to identitarian certainty and a language that resists that identitarian certainty. And in all parts of the world, you will find different versions of these languages being spoken. But I think there is no doubt that in the West and in other parts of the world, the language towards identitarian certainty is certainly in the ascendance, is certainly on top. And so, therefore, that makes it for me even more imperative to resist that as the language.
Yeah, taking off from your point about identity. So the texts of judgments like Nas, Naftesh, Nalsa, they are pretty neutral when it comes to things like culture, religion, and politics. But obviously, the text of these judgments and the background of the petitioners is very much influenced by their religious, cultural, and political beliefs and backgrounds. So, to what extent, since you've been engaged in multidisciplinary research, to what extent do you think that these judgments and these ideas of privacy, dignity, for in the context of gender and sexuality have been influenced by religious, cultural, and political factors, particularly in the Indian context?
I'm not sure about religious and political, I mean, except that everything that we're talking about is political. But certainly, I think educational or class, because all these judges are speaking a certain language that I've just been talking about, right? The language of privacy is a certain language that has been modeled for them in judgments from particularly the US, but also the UK and sometimes South Africa and sometimes Australia, that talk about gender and sexuality and desire in terms of privacy. So it is very telling, and I've written about this as well, that every single textbook, book of fiction, judgment that the Navtej judgment, for instance, refers to are all Western. They do not make a single reference to any book, text, practice, religious or otherwise, historical detail that might be located in the Indian subcontinent. So, to my mind, all those languages are not necessarily speaking a religious sort of dialect. For me, all of them are speaking a legal dialect premised on the notion of nation states, premised on the notion of privacy. And so, for me, that is what is problematic about that language, not necessarily their particular religious affiliation or their particular political affiliation.
Okay, so yeah, I just read your book, like, which says Law of Desire, Rulings on Sex and Sexuality in India. And I found one quote, like, provoking a very thought on me. And the quote was, Law defines the social, while desire threatens to disrupt it. The law of desire is therefore both a necessity and an impossibility. So, drawing from this, Do you think so that altering the law as was attempted with decriminalization of section 377 can affect the society or social? And do you think so then it can happen that desire will not threaten the society anymore? And how do you think that future legislation, like which are there in the pipeline, like same-sex marriage, will be received by the society?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. Again, it's a multiple question. The problem with decriminalizing Section 377 did not lie in the judgment so much, although it did for me, as much as in the process leading up to the judgment. So let me begin by saying it is absolutely absurd to criminalize any kind of sexual orientation, any kind of sexual desire. But of course, around the world, that is what people do because states try and control sexual desires and orientation. So it's absurd to do that. But to my mind, the outcome, based as it was on privacy and things like that, was heavily compromised. But the process of the hearings in court, the process of the tack taken by the legal team in 377, for me was also deeply problematic. And and I say this as someone who is friends with these lawyers. So it's not like I'm sort of criticizing them personally at all. But two episodes stand out in my mind. One is a sitting judge of the Supreme Court in open court while hearing the case for 377 actually asked, does anybody know any homosexuals? Because I don't. And since if no one knows any homosexuals, then why are we even talking about this law? And not a single person in the court actually raised their hand, not one. And we're talking about our educated lawyers, cosmopolitan lawyers who are certainly not homophobic, in open court to a phobic utterance from a sitting judge of the Supreme Court. No one responds, right? So that's one. Two, so to my mind, as you know, the wording of Section 377 is wonderfully vague, right? It prohibits carnal acts against the order of nature. Nothing was ever spelled out. In fact, the same law in England, when it was revised just about 20 or 30 years later, specified sodomy. But the version we got from Macaulay did not specify sodomy. So we actually had a lot of wiggle room. Specifies acts against carnal acts against the order of nature, which has been interpreted by law courts down the centuries as meaning non-reproductive acts. Now, every single person who is sexually active performs non-reproductive acts. If they didn't, the population of the world would be much bigger than it is. Which is to say, legally, the lawyers could have made a case not based on homosexuality, but based on sexuality as such, and saying, if you are outlawing carnal acts against the order of nature, every one of us in this courtroom is a criminal. And you need to take into consideration the letter of the law when you are pronouncing on it. That didn't happen either. And for a variety of strategic reasons, right? Because they thought that this would be the best way to get at it, again, based on the legal history in the US, that the best way to get at it would be to take the privacy tack and therefore to take the identitarian tack of saying this affects homosexuals. So to my mind, this was a lost opportunity. It was a golden opportunity that was lost. And so it's not the judgment itself, but the process and the thinking and the assumptions behind it that to my mind are interesting. Because then what happens is precisely what you said. What happens then is we get a state sanctioned version of desire. And the minute you get a state sanctioned version of desire, you're assuming that that desire is not going to threaten the state. And to my mind, desire is only interesting because it is always a threat. And the minute you tame it and try and say, please, please, please be nice to us because we won't trouble you, to my mind, that's a battle lost.
Oh, thank you, Professor. Just one final question that we had. How do you think querying these judgments or being indifferent to difference, as you argue, would change the current ways in which we look at these judgments constitutionally in constitutional terms, as Sarthak was mentioning earlier, through the lens of privacy, dignity, and equality?
You see, the thing is, if we take equality more seriously than privacy, I think that answers your question right away. And equality is, it's a fraught concept. But if we just say everyone who is a citizen of a particular country, and let me be clear, I don't believe in nation states and I don't believe in citizenship either. But let's just say that's the bottom line on which the law rests. If you say every citizen of the country is sort of should be given all the rights that we give any one citizen. So everybody who's a citizen gets all the rights, regardless of gender, religion, sexual orientation, political opinion, religious affiliation, all of that. None of that counts in front of the law. If you are saying that, then you're actually going on a different tack from the privacy tack. And you're also cutting out large swathes of our individual lives from the purview of the law. So we're saying basically who we are is no business of the law. What we do, if it negatively impinges on somebody else, then that is the purview of the law, which is to say we should only ever have criminal law. And even that, right, the whole argument to say that homosexuality should be decriminalized is because it was described as a crime without a victim. Right? There are no victims with sexual orientation. And so if we remove large swathes of who we are from the ambit of the law is going to have to take a very different direction. So if we begin with equality rather than with privacy, if we begin with the assumption that we're going to treat everybody equal rather than be suspicious of everybody and try and control them, I think we'll see a very different law, which is to say, I don't think we're going to be seeing that law anytime soon. Because law is like religion, right? It needs control over the maximum areas of life that it can exert control.